When union workers' wages or working conditions improve, the entire industry's conditions change. And that's another sort of ripple effect of strong unions. And we've also seen that when unions are strong, there's less racial and gender gaps in terms of people's well-being and their wages, because union wages set a new floor.
It's important to be part of a union because you have to have a voice.
Welcome to Union Talk. I'm Randi Weingarten.
So, welcome to Union Talk. Now, this is the first Union Talk that we've done. I'm Randi Weingarten, by the way, if you don't recognize my voice. But if you're listening to this podcast, you pretty much know that I do it about twice a month. And I have a lot more to say about this because I do think podcasts and radio are some of the ways that we have to communicate with people. But this is the first episode after the election, and I'm going to have a lot more thoughts in the next few days and weeks. But I'm grateful to talk to our guest because I think a lot of the answers in terms of why people voted the way they voted go back to the issues of aspiring Americans and whether they are here from generations from the Mayflower or whether they are here just for the last week or two. People come to America and stay in America and raise families in America because they see America as a place where their families and the next generation can do better than theirs. And in some ways, that has always been the promise of America, the abiding commitment of America, that we create opportunity and we create a voice through our democracy, but opportunity through our economy, through education, through labor movement, through growth of manufacturing, fairness and growth in a way that people can chase their own version of the American dream or can build their own version of the American dream, or the way in which I say it is can have that ladder of opportunity that they can climb. And so there is no one better actually to have this conversation than the Labor Secretary of the United States of America, acting, I have to use her title, Acting Secretary Sue. But Julie Su has been the Labor Secretary for the last couple of years, frankly, did a huge job in helping to deal with lots of the labor crises and strikes and other things that others would have found intractable, that she was able, because people trust her on both sides of every aisle, to help settle, like the longshoremen strike, like the machinist strike, like the UAW strikes. But part of Secretary Sue's genius is because she's trusted and she's beloved and she's as smart as a summer day is long and with a smile that can warm anybody's heart. And she cares. And there's no one better. If you really believe that this election was about the economy, there's actually no one better to talk to post-election than the Secretary of Labor, Julie Su. So welcome, Julie, to Union Talk. I'm really delighted that you are here with us. So,
Thank you. So kind. Thank you.
How are you feeling, by the way? I know this is a few days after, so I just want to make sure you're okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very glad to be in conversation with you. I love just how you teed this up, because I think it's not just you and I who believe in that promise of America. I feel like over the last almost 4 years, this administration has been really intent on restoring that promise. And it's one that I think for a lot of people, like you said, whether you've been here for many, many generations or, recently called the United States your home, people have felt like, especially working people, that promise has been out of reach. And so for us, it was all about, let's restore that. Let's invest in America in ways that we haven't done in too long. Let's make sure that everybody who wants one can find a good job that lets them live a good life and build for the future and transform their families and their communities. And it was a big project, and we took it really seriously. And I think we made real headway in it, and there's a lot more work to do.
I think that you and I were at an event together on classrooms to careers. And I think one of the things that was so not startling to me, but heartwarming to me and a little depressing is that if the administration probably had another 2 years before the election, and I'm not doing the would have, should have, could have, but what I saw, and this is part of what I want you to talk about a bit, is that for the first time in 50 or 60 years, what this administration tried to do was actually remake industrial policy. We basically had a very neoliberal policy, both with Democrats and Republicans in America, that basically held obeisance to the market. Mm-hmm. And whatever the market decided, the market decided. Whatever the capitalists decided, capitalists decided. I'm not being negative about capitalism, but it was basically market laissez-faire capitalism. And what Joe Biden did, I think, and some of it was done in COVID by Donald Trump and the legislature and by others throughout the world. But what Joe Biden specifically decided to do, and you were part of this, is to say, let's change industrial policy. Let's actually really reject trickle down and really build ground up, middle out. Now, a lot of people don't know what that means, but if you could take a little bit of time just in terms of explaining what the strategy was to actually create good jobs, good American manufacturing jobs, bring chips back, bring manufacturing back, bring infrastructure back, then have a workforce development strategy as part of it. What was that strategy and what was that goal?
Yeah.
So that people actually understand it and hear it.
It's a great question. So I think the simplest way to put it is that the president believes, and we all worked very hard to achieve, the basic idea that when workers do well, our economy is stronger and our nation is stronger. And fundamental to that is making sure that there are good jobs in every single community and good jobs that are available to everybody, even without a 4-year degree. And I would say some of it, you saw it from the very beginning, right? When the president first came into office and pushed forward and signed the American Rescue Plan Act. Many people said, if you go that big, if you put that much money into the economy, that much money into working families' pockets, the economy is going to overheat. It's too much. And he said no to that. He said, no, we've tried doing not enough before and it didn't work. So I'm doing something different this time. And that included things like restoring pensions, making sure, again, that workers recovered first and fast. And then his entire vision was to invest, as you just put it, Randi, into American industry and to make things in America again, right? If you just take the last administration, the number of jobs that were lost, we said this over and over again, the last administration was one of only 2 in the nation's history to leave office with fewer jobs than they came in with. That meant factories that closed. That meant communities that were devastated. That meant people who I met in my travels who had to leave their homes to go find a job somewhere else in order
I think there was about 200,000 factory jobs that had been lost. But, but I don't remember that. I don't have the number in front of me right now. I may have gotten it wrong.
Exactly. And people wanted to believe, I don't know, that there was something inevitable about that. There was nothing inevitable about it. And the idea of industrial policy is to say, no, we can reverse that. We can actually invest in industries in this country, including making things, because we have the workers, we have the talent, we have the capability, and we need to invest in the infrastructure for it. And we need all of our other policies, our workforce development, our labor laws, our trade policies to all be part of this bigger picture of how we invest in industries and allow manufacturing to flourish again in this country. And so the investments in chips are an example of that, right? Let's make semiconductors in the United States. And this whole project was really wildly successful. It just, unlike some of the American Rescue Plan Act investments, which had immediate results, this one was going to take a little bit longer, right? We had to actually build the facilities before we could hire people to do the manufacturing. Now, some of that is in motion, and we had to first put forward federal dollars in order for private dollars to say, okay, it's worth it for us to invest too. But all those things did happen, and we started to see a turnaround, right? So a very good example of all this is if you look at any of the manufacturing industry, semiconductors is one we talk about, but auto manufacturing is another one, right? Where we said, we believe that workers should do well. And so we focused on the well-being of workers negotiating their contract. The president showed up on a picket line. We said when industries profit, workers should benefit too. And what we saw was a growth in that industry, a return of factories. And also, as we think about, we also need to ensure that we have a good climate. So electric vehicles was part of that. So let's make electric vehicles here at home too. And then we built the workforce system around it to make sure that there were workers who could actually do that, who could build the vehicles, who could build the batteries, who could mine the raw materials. And all of these could and are good union jobs. So the overall vision was when workers do well, everybody does better. And all of our investments were meant to drive toward that goal. And we saw that the numbers speak for themselves, right? The number of jobs created, but also the fact that real wages are up, right? Mm-hmm. Workers are making more than they made before, and the rise in wages exceeded inflation. So that meant more breathing room for working families. We saw workers unionize across the country. Over 400,000 workers are now part of unions that were not in unions back in 2021 when President Biden first came into office. And we've celebrated lots of first contracts. So there are workers who have locked in gains that are going to reap benefits for a long time to come.
And I think, frankly, the best example of what you're also saying is that unionized workers actually felt this. Like we had in the last 2 years, from July 2022 to July 2024, 185 new units. I don't remember it, and I've been around a long time, and I've been a union president for a long time. We've never had that, you know? And so you could see, and we had 80,000 net new members in the last year. Even with all of the attacks, the level of growth was because people wanted unions, and many of us understood that you've got to organize the unorganized as well as organize the organized. And you have to think about new methods because of the gig economy and all sorts of other things. But there was fertile ground, not only because of what all of you did in terms of recreating industrial policy so that workers would benefit bottom up, middle out, but also understanding that unions create agency for people.
That's right.
And help nurture aspiration as opposed to the anger that so many other workers felt. And as a result, you saw the difference between workers in unions and how they voted and workers outside of unions and how they voted, or working class in unions versus working class outside of unions, which in some ways gets me to the next question. I mean, one of the ways in which some of us have been, and that's why I just want to get to where we were today, which was this whole notion of how we reshape schooling so that it is much more aligned. I mean, I love liberal arts. I was an AP Gov teacher in a career tech ed school, and I've taught college as well. And we are the largest college union in the United States. So the whole notion of liberal arts and what you need to do with critical thinking and problem solving is absolutely essential. But this notion of how you move schooling, public schooling, away from being test, to project-based instruction, to really kids really seeing and thinking and dreaming and acting and building projects and seeing jobs and seeing a workforce hub and seeing all this in front of them. Yeah. And the school, not just a community college, but a high school, being part of the conduit to that with Earn to Learn and whatever. I thought that the fact that you started building those pathways, those apprenticeships are really important. And that can really change America because it can change aspiration of young people in high school. What do you think?
Well, I agree with that 100%. And honestly, to pull in everything you're saying, part of it is when you are focused on good job creation, you also create more conditions for worker power, right? A tight labor market is good for workers. And so workers being willing to organize, workers organizing in parts of the country and in industries that were thought difficult to organize or unorganizable before is also really important, right? We saw workers in the South join unions in record numbers. I also have to say, this is not just because this is your show, but your partnership in all of this has been absolutely critical, right? When we said we want to create an administration in which unions not only have a seat at the table, but are helping to set the agenda, everything you just talked about is something you've been working on for a long time. So it was a privilege to be a part of that with you and to recognize, right, that when we create jobs, we create real opportunity, and we have to think about our educational system as part of that big picture, right? And
Absolutely.
our educational system is the gateway, the on-ramp into whatever future young people are going to have. And the idea that from a young age, people should be exposed to all kinds of broad opportunity. And those opportunities aren't real unless you actually have jobs, right? So that's why this idea of industrial policy is so important. We have to create the jobs. We have to have investment in those jobs. But then exposing young people early, giving them the experiential learning to do hands-on work, right? Something you and I are very passionate about, to show what they can do with their hands. The number of people I've met, again, in my travels, but also in my career, who say, I wasn't sure why I was learning about right angles and fractions until I actually had to build something, right? Or I don't know why I had to learn about biology or science until I actually had to take care of someone or heal somebody. I think those kinds of things are so important, and getting our educational system, seeing it as part of this big picture of how people are put on a fast track into an opportunity that's going to change their lives is really, really key to that. And I think it takes federal leadership and federal investment into that vision in order for it to happen, because testing is important. It plays some role, right? But the ways young people are tested don't always measure everything that they can do or everything that we need.
Right. As you know, I totally agree. And I think that if we really, truly transform schooling, so the point of entry for a young person who's in 10th grade or 11th grade or 9th grade, they could actually see all sorts of different opportunities, maybe even in middle school, not track, but create opportunity so that they could have all sorts of different workforce pathways. It would be incredible. I mean, it would be really incredible. And I saw it in terms of the two pathways we built with Micron in New York State, with 10 school districts, and the healthcare pathways that we're building in, and the apprenticeship pathways in nursing and in teaching, as well as in the trades.
Yeah. It's such a basic equity issue, right?
Yeah.
People can't do jobs that they don't know exist. And oftentimes for some communities where they don't have family members or neighbors who've done the jobs before, that kind of exposure from a young age through school makes a very, very big difference. The other thing, I think you've heard me share this, but in visiting registered apprenticeship programs in the trades, I met some people who were in their early 20s who said, oh my gosh, now we're using tools. We're using things like 3D printers that we didn't even know existed before, right? Which is great that they're being exposed now. But some kids in some school districts as young as, third grade are exposed to those kinds of things. So if we open up that exposure, it really helps to address some of the deep inequities.
Deep inequities and opportunity.
Yes.
And because if you don't see it, how do you do it if you don't see it?
Right.
How do you, no, absolutely. And public schooling is all over. And so if we can recreate public schooling in a way that makes these opportunities closer to where kids live and what they see, because 60% of kids who graduate from high school don't go to college. Right. I mean, so we have to create this point of opportunity and stackable credentials. We've learned this with college credits, with AP college credits, with dual college credits. We haven't learned this yet routinely with stackable credentials, as you said, in terms of how you make this and shape this more as the norm. I have two more questions for you that I really, really, really want to ask. One is, there's a huge difference between where the labor movement was and where other workers were. And I would say that routinely, what I heard over and over and over again on the campaign trail was that my grocery prices were too high, or I couldn't make it day to day. Now, I know, and you know, the first best answer is a union contract that is above market rates. And that's what we can do in terms of a union contract. But what do we do in the interim? And how do we, in some ways, so I'm not asking you the question about the president-elect's administration. I'm asking you the question as a kind of fellow activist who's now sat at this perch for a while very successfully. What do we do to really help working people and the working class in America?
Yeah. So I think that's
the Francis Perkins question.
That's the important question going forward. And if we presume that we have to answer that question in the absence of congressional action, right? Meaning that there's not going to be a full, to your point, right, of FDR style New Deal of higher wages and more protections for working people and thinking about what the safety net looks like, then I do think, let me step back for one moment just to say this idea that prices went up was true post-COVID all across the world. And really, because of, I would say, the leadership that we had here in the United States, the Biden-Harris administration, the inflation rate got down to pre-pandemic levels faster than almost any other country. So I think that fact is worth stating. But the reality is that I think it was more a reflection of people were struggling and certain things remained out of reach, right? Housing, certain costs that have just been too high for too long. I think I will give two answers. One is, I do think that the administration's focus on, and again, there was much more work to do on this, but on addressing corporate consolidation is a very important part of the answer, right? It is when you have monopoly behavior that not just harms consumers, but also can harm workers when it comes to the right to organize and the ability to exercise power. That has been very harmful for a very long time. And it may not be the most obvious thing because people go into grocery stores and think there's like a million products, but the number of companies that own each of those has been shrinking. And that is a problem. And that's going to be a problem for prices and other kinds of people's sense of well-being, right? It's the whole CEO salaries are some 300 times frontline worker pay. That legitimately doesn't feel good for people. Even if their wages are going up, they still see, I saw this when I was at the bargaining table, right? We had CEOs saying, no, that wage increase you want is too much, while they made hundreds of times what their workers made. We have to address that, and addressing just monopoly behavior among companies is a really important part of that. But the other part of it, and you know this well, is I think continuing to support union power and the ability of workers to act in solidarity, to have a real voice on the job, to be able to leverage their power as workers, whether it's through negotiating, striking, or something else, to continue to push for better. Because that's not just good for union workers, right? We certainly saw the benefits in the historic contracts that unionized workers, including teachers, were winning all across the country in multiple industries. But we also saw, and we continue to see, that when union workers' wages and working conditions improve, the entire industry's conditions change. And that's another sort of ripple effect of strong unions. And we've also seen that when unions are strong, there's less racial and gender gaps in terms of people's well-being and their wages, because union wages set a new floor, and that benefits everybody else there, right? So I would say that those things need to happen. They should continue to happen. We've seen a surge in worker power and union popularity in the last few years. Those are good things. And again, the state of the economy really does speak for itself. Unfortunately, there were politicians who thought that it was in their best interest to say that everything was bad, right? Everything was horrible, and somebody other than themselves was needed to save it. But working people have always, through solidarity, been the answer to equity and justice, and that will continue to be the case.
So I wanted to ask you, I know our time is running short, so I do actually have two last questions for you. One was, I want to make sure that our listeners understand who I'm talking to. So you weren't only named on these top lawyer lists in the top 75 women litigators in California and California super lawyers, and in the top 75 labor and employment lawyers. You weren't only the California Labor Commissioner. But one of the things that you did, which was really remarkable, was this: you were the lead attorney for a very important and frankly frightening case called the El Monte tie garment slavery case. And you were able to hold that business liable for wage theft and literal slavery, where they were forcing workers to work against their will. And I raise this now as people like Elon Musk and others are trying to get rid of all regulation whatsoever, OSHA regulation, safety and health regulation. I raise this case kind of as a warning sign. So what did that case teach you? And then the last question I'm going to ask is what gives you hope? But what did that case teach you?
So my answer to the two questions might be the same. This was a group of workers, as you noted. These were a group of 80 garment workers who were trafficked to the United States from Thailand and then forced to sew garments in an apartment complex behind barbed wire and under armed guard, where they were not allowed to leave. All of their phone calls were monitored. Their mail was censored. And this was modern day indentured servitude. And they were sewing garments for some of our nation's top manufacturers and retailers. And when the workers were first discovered, they were thrown into a federal immigration detention center and told they were going to be deported. So that was exactly what their captors told them was going to happen, that if you ever report us, you're the one who's going to be punished, which is also why the idea that workers deserve protections regardless of immigration status is such an important piece of this story. But when I met the workers, they were still being detained. And I worked with a small group of activists to gain their freedom and then represented them in a lawsuit against not just their captors, who were certainly responsible as well, but also the companies that they were sewing for. Because this was a situation, it's not an aberration. It's really one end of a spectrum of abuse that too many workers have to endure. We take sweatshop abuses in the garment industry to be sort of a matter of course. And when workers are thought of as invisible or less than, this is the kind of thing that happens, right? They're dehumanized to the point where people literally do not see them. And we were able to sue all the companies that they were sewing for, call for corporate accountability, made some good case law that's been relied on since then to hold the top of the chain responsible for the conditions of workers in their contractors and subcontractors' shops. But I think the lesson learned, one of them was that sometimes workers are extremely vulnerable, but their ability and their willingness to stand together and to fight back is very, very powerful in ways that I think people often underestimate. Right? So here in this position in government, sometimes I've heard people say, well, we can't get workers to speak up. We don't need to do that work because the workers are too vulnerable to speak up to begin with. They're too afraid. And what I've learned throughout my life and my career is that it's not that workers are afraid. It's that sometimes those of us in power are too afraid to actually step in and take the risks to fight for them. And so that's one thing that I learned. But I also learned that you can make tremendous change if you don't sort of accept as natural the abuse, accept as inevitable, right? That some workers are just going to have to work in certain kinds of conditions. Why? Why do we accept that? And that there should be a floor beneath which nobody should have to work and live. And enforcing that floor, trying to make that floor real for people has really been sort of the passion of my life and the work of my career. And to be able to do it here at the Department of Labor under a president who, when he said, we're going to build a country that works for working people, right? And as you said, from the middle out and the bottom up, it made the Department of Labor's work more important, I think, than it's ever been, maybe since Franklin D. Roosevelt. And so really making sure that the department stood up in that moment, delivered in that moment, unleashed our full power to protect workers was something that I took really seriously. And it gives me hope that we were able to make significant progress, right? Whether it was rules that helped to make sure more workers were entitled to overtime, make sure that workers were entitled to mental health services when they went to seek health care, doing the first nationwide proposed rule to protect workers from the hazards of heat, right? Those were all things that we did, but also enforcement, saying to workers who toil in the shadows, who feel like there's no one looking out for them, that we see you, we hear you, we're here to protect you. We collected over $1 billion in wages and damages for workers, many of whom do not have any other representation. And we feel good about that. And so I think once workers feel their power, it's hard to reverse that. And
exactly.
Right, any way of supporting that, I think, is about making workers' lives better, but also making our country stronger. And going back to your first point, it's about fulfilling that promise of America, that when you go to work, you're supposed to get what you're paid, what you were promised, right? You're supposed to come home healthy and safe. And that doesn't happen by itself. It happens because workers come together. It's because unions fight for it. And it's because you need to have government there to help put in place and then enforce that basic floor.
Yeah, that was amazing. As you were talking, Secretary Sue, Yes. Normally we call each other Randy and Julie, but we're on a podcast. But as you were talking, what I was thinking is one of the important next steps, and one of the things I learned from this election experience, is how little the two sides of America talk to each other and how little people hear outside of their normal bubble or their normal news sources. If there are news sources, a lot of news sources are YouTube or X or Fox or MSNBC for the other set of America. And part of what you just talked about is how much a Department of Labor that is actually trying to create fairness for people, fairness for decent conditions at work so that they not have heat strokes in the summer or it's freezing cold in the winter, or that they're not locked up in involuntary servitude, or in Francis Perkins' times, they're not in a fire and burned to death in the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. I mean, these are the regulations of the Labor Department. These are the wage theft, the making sure that if you earn a decent wage, somebody actually pays it to you and somebody can force them to do it so you don't have to have a lawyer. So that's how we find a way that explains in common parlance some of the things that we do to fight for everyone. And when you have a union, you can have those conversations on an ongoing basis and even create the power on an ongoing basis to attain more, attain the promise of America, because we do that in terms of that collective power.
Yeah.
So it's a big reminder, not only just of the incredible work you've done, not only in the last 2 years that you've been the acting labor secretary, but for all these years, both at the Labor Department, at the California Labor Department, at the Legal Services Fund that you were at, and the Asian American Advancing Justice Los Angeles, all of that. But it also tells us how we have to be really, really better in listening to each other and in finding ways to communicate real aspiration and real work that when it gets done, people hear it and they don't tune it out because they feel it's not their tribe that's talking about it. And that, I think, is a lesson that I've learned in this last few months because of all the work all of you have done that really long-term will benefit the working class in America and the middle class in America, and frankly, fight for Americans to have a better life. So I just want to say thank you for everything. And to our listeners, I'll spend much more time over the next month or so talking about the election, but I really wanted you to get a chance to listen to an incredible person, the Acting Secretary of Labor, Julie Su. So thank you, Julie, for joining us today.
Thank you, President Weingarten, for your extraordinary leadership. Truly, it has been a privilege to work alongside you, to fight alongside you, and I know that we have much more work to do, so count me in for that.
Great. Fantastic.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Union Talk. Remember to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast and tune in every other week for a new episode. Thank you, be safe, and be well.